Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we are plunging right into one of the most, dynamic and intellectually urgent periods in history, Hellenistic philosophy.
Absolutely. We're talking about the time after Alexander the Great's death, running up to around 31 BCE.
And this isn't just some dusty museum trip, is it? This is really a blueprint for practical living, forged in a time of massive social and political uncertainty.
That's exactly right. Empires were rising and falling. People's conventional lives were dissolving around them. You had these major schools, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Skeptics, offering, frankly, radical and competing paths to find some kind of stability.
And finding that stability, that tranquility, was the core mission, wasn't it?
It really was. The sources are quite clear on this. Everyone recognized people felt adrift, buffeted by fortune, by events they couldn't understand. So the ultimate goal was practical, providing a kind of philosophical architecture for the human soul to achieve what they called ataraxia.
Ataraxia, profound tranquility, freedom from internal disturbance.
Exactly. And crucially, this wasn't just about, say, ethical advice. It required a complete system.
Right. That systemic approach is what I find so fascinating. They didn't just offer, life hacks. They built these comprehensive interlocking structures. What do our sources tell us about how they actually organized this huge philosophical project?
Well, they generally structured philosophy into three integrated parts. They understood you couldn't really separate them.
Okay.
First, there was logic, or the Epicureans often called it canonic.
Yeah.
This dealt with how we know things, what the criteria of truth is.
The foundation, essentially.
The foundation. Second, physics, the study of the cosmos, causality, the nature of reality itself.
Which informs how we understand the world we're trying to navigate.
Precisely. And finally, ethics. This was the ultimate end goal, defining how we use the knowledge from the first two parts to actually secure the good life, to achieve that ataraxia.
So logic justifies physics, and physics supports ethics.
It was an incredibly tight feedback loop, all designed to guide you toward that tranquil life.
Okay, so let's really unpack this first pillar, logic and canonic. Because if your whole goal is to remove misery by fixing false beliefs, well, you absolutely have to have a reliable criterion for truth first.
You do. If you can't trust your senses or your reason, the whole ethical project just collapses before it starts.
And this is where the fundamental war broke out between these schools, wasn't it?
Absolutely. This is philosophical battleground zero. Let's maybe start with the Epicurean approach. It's delightfully straightforward on the surface, but deeply controversial.
Okay.
They assert a really bold, foundational claim. All sense perceptions, aesthesis, are true. They're evident in Argus. The immediate sense datum itself is infallible.
Wait, hang on. All of them? So if I'm looking down a hot desert road and I see that shimmering water, a mirage.
The Epicurean says that visual perception is true. That sounds like a bit of a non-starter for building knowledge.
Ah, but this is where their physics comes rushing in to support their theory of knowledge.
How so? Remember, the Epicurean universe is entirely material, just atoms and void. So perception itself gets a materialistic explanation. Tiny, perfect atomic images, which they called stearemnia-like thin films, are constantly streaming off the surfaces of objects.
Like little movie frames radiating outwards.
Exactly like that. These images influx, they strike our sense organs. And because the sense impression is the direct physical result of that atomic process hitting the organ, the impression itself, the raw sensation, is guaranteed to be true. The physics validates the sensation.
Okay, so back to the mirage. The atomic images hitting my eye did convey a certain pattern of light and heat reflection, and that sensation was true, in a sense.
Precisely. But that leads us straight to the classic puzzle used against them. The straight ore that looks bent or broken when you stick it in water. How do they maintain the infallibility of the senses when sight and touch clearly seem to contradict each other here?
Yeah, how do they handle that?
This is the critical Epicurean distinction. The conflict, they argue, doesn't actually reside in the immediate sense data. Your sense of touch reports a straight ore that's a true impression from the atoms hitting your hand. Your sense of sight reports a curved or bent impression that's also true because that's the physical image that actually reached your eye after being refracted by the water.
Oh.
Both inputs are true reports of what arrived at the sense organ.
So the problem isn't the senses, it's what comes next.
Exactly. The conflict arises in the subsequent step, opinion, doxa, the judgment we make about the sense impressions.
The interpretation.
Yes, the judgment or the assent, where you wrongly combine those separate true sense impressions and you predicate the evidence incorrectly. If you jump to the conclusion, the opinion, the ore is bent intrinsically and everywhere, well then you've made a mistake. But the mistake isn't about the sensory input, it's about your faulty interpretation or extrapolation from that input. The impression itself is passive, true, infallible.
So the job of reason, logismos, isn't to somehow correct or override the senses, but more to adjudicate the information they provide, considering the conditions.
Precisely. Reason's task is actually quite sophisticated here. First, it needs to inspect the natural conditions, the light, the medium like water, the distance, to understand why the atomic images might have been modified or distorted on their way to the eye.
Right.
Then, reason organizes all the evidence coherently. It uses principles like non-contradiction, comparing the report from sight with the report from touch, maybe checking from different angles, to revise that faulty initial opinion. You don't blame the messenger, the sense, for the chaotic environment, the water that distorted the message.
It's all about getting the opinion right, based on reliable sensory input.
And the ultimate goal is ethical, to eliminate those opinions that cause us distress, the tarache, precisely because they are based on faulty extrapolations from what are actually true sense data.
Okay, that's a remarkably tight system. Now, if we pivot to the Stoics, they seem to have far less initial faith in just the raw sense impression. Their criterion, the famous cognitive impression, catalepsis, sounds like it's built like a fortress against error.
It is. You have to remember, the Stoics were already deeply engaged with and reacting to the challenges coming from skepticism. So their standard for knowledge had to be incredibly rigorous.
So what did they require for an impression to count as cognitive, as catalepsis, to grant actual knowledge?
They laid out 3 really stringent conditions. First, obviously, the impression must be true. It has to accurately reflect reality.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, it must arise from a real existing object. It can't be a hallucination or a dream.
Still seems reasonable.
But here's the killer third condition, the one specifically developed to counter the skeptics, particularly the academic skeptics.
Yeah.
The impression must be of such a specific kind, so clear and distinct, that it could not possibly arise from something that is not that object. It has to basically bear an unmistakable mark of certainty that guarantees its fidelity to the unique object it represents.
Wow. So it's not enough for it to just be true. It has to be sort of impossibly false. It carries its own guarantee.
Exactly. It has to be self-validating in a very strong sense.
Okay, so why did the skeptics jump all over this? Why did they argue that this incredibly high standard could, in practice, never actually be met?
They relentlessly hammered away at this using the challenge of the counterparts, or indistinguishable objects.
Like identical twins, or mass-produced items.
Precisely. The skeptics asked, how can the Stoic possibly guarantee that every unique object in the world, say, 2 coins struck from the same die, or 2 eggs laid by the same hen, or indeed visually identical twins, makes a unique, distinctive, guaranteeing impression that is actually accessible to the perceiver?
Ah, the accessibility is key.
It is. Because if 2 genuinely distinct objects can produce impressions that are, for all intents and purposes, phenomenologically identical to the perceiver, then any given impression fails that crucial third condition of catalepsis. Why? Because that impression could have arisen from a different object, the other twin, the other coin. If you misidentify the source, your belief based on that impression could be false, meaning the impression itself wasn't guaranteed.
So the Stoics couldn't just say, trust your gut.
Definitely not. They had to retreat into their metaphysics to defend this.
Yeah.
Given their view of a dense, rationally ordered cosmos where everything is unique down to the finest detail.
They're physics again.
Right. They argued that, metaphysically, no 2 distinct things in the universe can be absolutely identical. There must always be some difference, even if it's just the exact arrangement of atoms, or tiny imperceptible blemishes or variations.
Okay, metaphysically distinct, but the skeptics weren't having it, were they?
No, they were quick to retort. Fine, that's a claim about the underlying reality, about metaphysics, but that doesn't guarantee those minute, subtle differences are actually accessible to the perceiving subject. The differences might exist objectively, but the impression hitting your mind, the phenomenal experience, might still appear identical for both objects. And if it appears identical, it fails the cognitive criterion for you, the perceiver, in that moment. You can't be certain.
So for the Stoic, achieving true knowledge, episteme, wasn't just a passive reception like the Epicurean aesthesis seemed to be. It was an active intellectual accomplishment, almost a moral one.
Absolutely. Episteme is a hard-won intellectual achievement, really reserved for the ideal figure of this Stoic sage who represents the perfection of reason.
And how does the sage achieve this?
Through rigorous discipline of judgment. The sage develops the unerring ability to discern the truly cognitive impressions, the catalepses, and to assent only to those, while completely withholding assent from any impression that doesn't meet that strict standard, the non-cognitive ones.
So it's about controlling your assent.
It's all about controlling assent. This secure, rational assent is what transforms mere apprehension or catalepsis into full-blown knowledge, episteme. If you assent rashly, based on unclear or non-guaranteeing impressions, you risk falling into error and doubt. And for the Stoic soul aiming for ataraxia, your beliefs absolutely must be built on a secure, unshakable foundation. Only catalepsis could provide that.
Which brings us neatly to the third major player, the skeptics. Their whole project seems aimed not at finding a criterion, but at dismantling the very idea that a reliable criterion could ever be found. Their goal was epoche suspension of judgment.
Exactly. Both main branches, the Pyrrhonians and the later academics like Carneades, used powerful arguments to induce a state of universal suspension of all judgments or beliefs.
And their primary weapon was this problem of the criterion.
Yes, they really highlighted this inescapable logical recursion. It goes something like this. If you claim you found a criterion of truth, how do you know it's the right criterion? How do you validate it? Well, presumably you need to test it against things you already know are true.
Okay.
But wait, how did you establish those truths in the first place? To identify truths reliably, you seem to need a criterion.
It's a vicious circle. You need truths to find the criterion, and you need the criterion to find the truths.
It's a debilitating loop. And this argument was particularly devastating, the skeptics argued, against philosophies like Stoicism or Epicureanism, what we might call revisionary philosophies, because they actively challenge common sense or prevailing opinions. Their case for their unique criterion had to be incredibly strong and self-sufficient, and the skeptics essentially argued it never could be because of this recursive problem.
Now, the Stoics, looking at this project of universal doubt, immediately hit back with a huge practical objection. The inaction objection, or apraxia.
This was the big gun aimed at skepticism. The charge was simple. If you genuinely suspend all judgments, if you literally believe nothing, how could you possibly act? How do you decide to eat when hungry or step out of the way of a charging bull? Action seems to require some kind of belief or assent to an impulse.
Right. If you believe nothing, you'd just be paralyzed, unable to function in the world.
That was the charge. A universal suspension of assent seems to entail a complete inability to engage in practical life. But the skeptical defense, particularly as articulated by Carneades of the Academy, was incredibly clever. It relied on introducing a crucial psychological subtlety.
They drew a line between full-blown belief and something less committal.
Exactly that. Carneades carefully distinguished between full dogmatic assent, the kind the Stoics required for knowledge, and the kind the skeptic withholds entirely, and a lesser, more tentative mental state, which he sometimes termed approval or following.
And this involved the idea of the plausible impression.
Yes, the epiphany fantasia. This is an impression that first strongly strikes its possessor as being true. It has a certain persuasive quality. And second, crucially, it coheres well with other relevant impressions and with the conditions under which it was formed. It just seems likely it fits the picture.
So the skeptic doesn't believe with certainty that the chariot is definitely going to hit them. But the impression of the rapidly approaching chariot is extremely plausible, and it coheres with past experiences of rapidly approaching objects.
Precisely. And that plausibility is enough to guide action. For the skeptic, action isn't guided by a dogmatic belief or certain knowledge, but by following what appears plausible, what seems likely, what coheres with experience and custom, without ever giving full philosophical assent to its ultimate objective truth.
So you step back from the chariot, not because you know it will hit you, but because it appears highly plausible that it will, and stepping back seems the reasonable course based on appearances.
Exactly. You follow customs, instincts, bodily needs, laws, and these plausible appearances. The psychological state guiding your action is sufficient for practical life. And importantly, it doesn't require you to take on the heavy burden of claiming absolute knowledge or certainty. This defense effectively saved the skeptic from the charge of apraxia, allowing them to live a functional life while maintaining their state of epic, their suspension of judgment. Okay, that was a huge philosophical battle over just how we know things. Having sort of established, or in the skeptic's case, failed to establish a criterion for knowledge, all these schools then pivoted to what was really the main event: securing the soul's tranquility, achieving eudaimonia, the good life. Let's look at the Epicurean path first, which is famously defined by pleasure. Yes, for Epicurus, philosophy was essentially medicine for the soul. Its sole aim was intensely practical. Guide your actions to remove trouble, reshape, from your mind and pain from your body.
And physics serve this goal.
Directly. By replacing troubling superstitions like fearing vengeful gods or eternal punishment with true, calming beliefs about a material, non-interfering universe, physics cleared the way for ethical tranquility. They were hedonists, yes, but it was a very specific, very regulated kind of hedonism.
Right. They certainly weren't advocating for the kind of wild sensory indulgence that Epicurean sometimes implies today. This was really prudent hedonism focused on achieving stability above all else.
It's absolutely the key. They made a fundamental distinction between two types of pleasure. First, there's kinetic pleasure, kinetic meaning movement or process. This is the active stimulation you get from satisfying a desire, the pleasure of eating when you're hungry, the enjoyment of listening to music. It's good, but it's temporary, comes and goes.
Okay. And the other type?
The other, and for them, the highest, most complete and lasting good is katastematic pleasure. This means static or stable pleasure. It's the state of being free from suffering. Aponia for the body, which means the absence of physical pain, and ataraxia for the mind, the absence of mental trouble or disturbance.
So it's pleasure defined as the absence of pain.
Exactly. They believed this katastematic pleasure was perfect and complete. Once you achieved it, it couldn't actually be increased because pleasure simply existed wherever suffering was absent. You couldn't be more free from pain than totally free from pain.
And the role of reason here is to?
Reason's job is essentially to minimize the disruptive pursuit of those varying, often unnecessary kinetic pleasures, and instead guide you towards establishing and maintaining that lasting, stable state of katastematic pleasure. It's about simplifying and stabilizing your state of being.
This focus on stability and reducing disturbance led them to their famous, and I think incredibly insightful, taxonomy of desire.
Yes, this taxonomy is basically the Epicureans' practical guide to achieving tranquility. It serves almost as the ultimate anti-consumerist manual, even today. Epicurus believed that if you truly understand what you need, you can limit your dependencies on external things and maximize your autonomy, your self-sufficiency.
So how do they break down desires?
They divide desires into three main categories. First, you have the natural and necessary desires.
Okay, like what?
These are things required for survival and basic comfort, and they're generally easy to secure. Basic food, water, shelter, basic clothing. These must be fulfilled for life and comfort, but crucially, nature makes them relatively easy to satisfy. You don't need much to meet these needs.
Right, that makes sense. Simple needs, easily met.
Second, there are the natural but unnecessary desires. These are still rooted in nature, but they're extravagant or embellished versions of the necessary ones.
Like fancy food instead of plain bread. Gourmet meals, fine wines, luxurious homes.
Exactly. These things are natural in the sense that they provide pleasure, but they aren't necessary for life, health, or even tranquility. The Epicurean view is, these are welcome if they happen to come your way easily, without struggle or anxiety. But the prudent person must not trouble themselves or compromise their peace of mind to acquire them. Chasing them creates dependency and instability.
Okay, so enjoy them if they fall in your lap, but don't make them your goal. And the third group, these are the really problematic ones.
These are the most dangerous for tranquility. The unnatural and unnecessary desires. These aren't grounded in our nature at all, but are products of empty, vain opinions, often social conditioning.
Like what sort of things?
Think of the desire for immense wealth, political power, public fame, luxury purely for status. These desires, Epicurus argued, are limitless because they're defined by opinion, not need. They must be completely jettisoned, actively rooted out.
Why so dangerous?
For several reasons. They're inherently difficult, often impossible to fully satisfy. They cause maximal pain and anxiety if they remain unsatisfied. Think of the anguish of a ruined politician or a celebrity who loses fame. And, crucially, pursuing them completely compromises your autonomy because their satisfaction is constantly dependent on external factors, the opinions of others, the turns of fortune, things utterly outside your control.
So the core Epicurean insight is that the smart strategy for happiness isn't necessarily to get more stuff to satisfy your desires,
but rather to reduce the scope of your desires down to the natural and necessary, the easily obtainable ones. That way you achieve self-sufficiency and are less vulnerable to fortune and disappointment.
Now, the Epicureans knew that perhaps the biggest source of mental disturbance, of terrashe, is the fear of death. To achieve ataraxia, they had to dismantle this fear, using their physics and logic. What was their main line of argument?
It's famously known as the experience argument, and it's beautifully direct, relying entirely on their materialist view of the soul.
Okay, how does it work?
Premise 1. Everything that is genuinely good or bad for us must be something we can experience through sensation. We only know benefit or harm through feeling it.
Makes sense. Pain is bad because it feels bad.
Premise 2. Death, according to their physics, is the complete and utter deprivation of all sense experience. The soul is just a particular arrangement of fine atoms within the body, and at death, these atoms disperse. Consciousness ceases entirely. There is no experiencer left.
Okay, so good and bad require experience. Death ends experience.
Conclusion. Therefore, death is literally nothing to us. It cannot be experienced. Since it can't be experienced, it cannot be good or bad for the person who dies. The state of being dead contains no sensation, therefore no harm.
So fearing death is fearing a state you will never actually encounter or experience.
Precisely. You're fearing a blank, a void which cannot hurt you. Lucretius, who was one of the greatest poetic expositors of Epicureanism, hammered this home with his famous symmetry argument.
What's the symmetry argument?
Lucretius argued, look back at the eternity of time before you were born. You didn't exist then. Does that infinite period of prenatal non-existence bother you now? Do you resent missing out on all those millennia?
No, of course not. It seems irrelevant.
Exactly. So Lucretius asks, why should the infinite period of postmortem non-existence, which is structurally identical, just non-existence, bother you? We should regard the state after death with the exact same indifference we regard the state before birth. The fear, they argue, is irrational, rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of what the state of death actually entails. Simply the absence of sensation.
Powerful arguments aim squarely at achieving mental peace. Now, let's switch gears completely to Stoic ethics. We move from this calculated pursuit of stable pleasure to the rigorous pursuit of pure, unadulterated reason as the guide to life. This system has deep roots in Socrates, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, was heavily influenced by figures like Socrates and also by the Cynics, like Crates. That Cynic influence set a tone for rigor, for living simply, and for transcending mere social conventions.
And they embraced those Socratic paradoxes.
Very much so. Ideas like virtue as knowledge, that acting virtuously is a matter of understanding the good and all the virtues are interconnected. You can't be brave without also being just and wise, etc. These were foundational.
And their core ethical principle?
The core principle is deceptively simple. Live according to nature. Well, for a rational being like a human, living according to nature means living according to reason. Nature gave us reason as our unique guiding faculty. Therefore, the perfection of reason is virtue. And for the Stoics, virtue is the only thing that is truly good. It's both necessary and sufficient for eudaimonia, for true human flourishing.
The only good.
The only intrinsic good. Consequently, vice, the corruption of reason, is the only thing that is truly bad, truly evil.
This stark division, only virtue is good, only vice is bad, immediately forced them to introduce that famous and often quite challenging category of the indifference. Why do they need this third category for basically everything else in life, like health, wealth, reputation, even pleasure and pain?
It's a logical consequence of making virtue the sole good. Think about it. Most people naturally assume things like health and wealth are good and sickness and poverty are bad. But if health were intrinsically good, then a sick person couldn't be fully virtuous or happy.
Right. Their happiness would depend on something external, their health.
Exactly. And for the Stoics, the sage's eudaimonia had to be completely self-sufficient, totally invulnerable to the whims of fortune. If your flourishing depends on anything outside your own rational choice, it's insecure. Therefore, all these external things, health, sickness, wealth, poverty, reputation, obscurity, pleasure, pain, must be classified as neither intrinsically good nor intrinsically evil. They are, in themselves, morally indifferent.
So their moral value isn't inherent in them, but comes purely from how we use them.
Precisely. They are like raw materials or tools. A hammer isn't good or bad in itself. Its moral value depends entirely on whether you use it virtuously, say to build a house for someone, or viciously, to harm someone. The indifference lies in the thing itself. The moral quality resides in the use, which stems from our reason and choice.
But surely they recognize that some indifference are generally preferable to others. Like, health is usually better than sickness for living a rational life.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't denying practical realities. Within this large class of indifference, they distinguish between preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference.
Okay.
Preferred indifference are things like health, strength, sufficient resources, good reputation, things that are generally in accordance with nature, and usually help us function effectively as rational beings. Reason naturally commends us to select and pursue these things, all else being equal.
But possessing them doesn't make you virtuous.
Correct. Possessing preferred indifference does not add one iota to your actual virtue or happiness, and losing them, becoming sick or poor, does not diminish your virtue, provided you respond to that loss virtuously. Correspondingly, things like sickness, poverty, pain are dispreferred. Reason guides us to avoid them, but enduring them virtuously doesn't make you any less happy in the Stoic sense.
This leads directly then to Epictetus's really practical formulation of moral progress, the framework we now often call the dichotomy of control.
Yes, this is perhaps the most enduringly practical piece of Stoic advice. Epictetus hammered this home. You must constantly rigorously distinguish between what is truly up to us and what is not up to us.
What falls into each category?
What's entirely up to us, according to the Stoics, are our internal states and activities. Our judgments, our opinions, our impulses to act or not act, our desires and aversions, and fundamentally, the quality of our rational assent. These are the things we have direct, complete control over.
And what's not up to us?
Pretty much everything external. Our body, its health, its features, our property and possessions, our reputation in the eyes of others, our social status, political office, and ultimately, the outcomes of our actions in the world. These things are subject to fate, chance, the actions of others. They are fundamentally outside our direct control.
So moral progress, becoming virtuous, hinges entirely on focusing our efforts where we actually have control.
Exactly. It's about using the things not up to us, the indifference like health or wealth or reputation, well, virtuously, which is up to us. You can't control whether you get sick, but you can control how you respond to sickness with courage and patience, virtue, or with fear and complaint, vice. The power, the moral significance lies entirely in the quality of your internal response, your choice, your judgment.
They often use that famous archery analogy to clarify this focus on intention and process over outcome, right? Distinguishing the target from the true end.
Yes, it's a brilliant analogy. They distinguish between the skopos, which is the external target or mark the archer aims at, and the telos, which is the archer's true end or goal.
So the skopos is hitting the bullseye, getting the external result, like becoming healthy or wealthy.
Right. The skopos is the preferred indifferent, the external outcome we select and aim for. But hitting the bullseye is ultimately not entirely up to the archer. A sudden gust of wind, a flaw in the arrow, these external factors can intervene. It's partly dependent on fortune.
So what is the telos, the true end that is up to the archer?
The telos is the activity of aiming well. It's the skillful exercise of the art of archery itself. Correctly doing everything in the archer's power, choosing the right stance, drawing the bow correctly, judging the wind, releasing smoothly, basically, acting in accordance with the principles of good archery. That activity, the aiming well, is entirely up to the archer.
So virtue isn't found in hitting the target, but in the skillful, rational process of shooting.
Precisely. Virtue, for the Stoic, is found in the skillful exercise of choice and action, in living consistently in agreement with reason and nature, in selecting and using indifference correctly. That's the palos. Whether you actually obtain the preferred indifferent you were aiming for, the skopos, is secondary and ultimately irrelevant to your virtue and happiness. By placing the telos entirely within the sphere of our rational choice and action, the Stoic aims to guarantee that the ultimate good, eudaimonia, is absolutely secure, self-sufficient, and immune to the blows of fortune.
Okay, it seems like both the Epicureans, with their focus on autonomous choice regarding desires, and the Stoics, with their emphasis on virtuous assent, built these incredible ethical systems that absolutely hinged on human moral agency, our ability to choose freely and take responsibility for those choices.
They absolutely did. Responsibility is central to both.
Yet, as we touched on earlier, their own underlying physical theories, especially around causation, seem to create a massive challenge to that very idea of freedom and agency. For the Stoics, this was the profound problem of strict determinism, wasn't it?
It was a huge internal tension in their system. Stoic physics, as we mentioned, describes a universe that is thoroughly rational, completely interconnected, and materially unified. They posited these two fundamental principles, active and passive. The active principle is God, or reason, logos, or providence, or fate. They use these terms almost interchangeably. It's conceived as a rational, ordering force, a sort of creative fire or breath, pneuma, that pervades and structures the entire cosmos.
And this pneuma links everything together.
Yes, it links all parts of the universe in a kind of perfect sympathy.
Right.
There's nothing outside this rationally ordered, causally interconnected system. It's a unified whole.
And the implication of this seamless causal linkage is that all events, past, present, and future, are fated, determined hymarmone. It's one vast, unbroken chain of antecedent causes and effects stretching back infinitely.
Exactly. Nothing happens randomly or without a cause in the Stoic universe. Every event is necessitated by what came before.
Which naturally provoked that burning question. If absolutely everything is fated, predetermined by this cosmic chain of causation, how can we possibly be held morally responsible for our choices and actions? If my decision to act virtuously or viciously was already necessitated by the state of the universe billions of years ago, how can I genuinely be praised or blamed for it?
This was a problem right from the start. Zeno, the founder, apparently struggled with it. It really fell to Chrysippus, the brilliant third head of the Stoic school, to develop a sophisticated defense that attempted to reconcile their strict determinism with the possibility of human freedom and moral responsibility.
How did Chrysippus try to square that circle? It seems almost impossible.
His solution involved making a subtle but crucial distinction between different types of causes. It required some real philosophical finesse. He distinguished between what he called antecedent, external causes, the events, and the great chain of fate leading up to a particular situation, which he sometimes called perfect and principal causes. And then auxiliary and proximate causes, which crucially depend on the internal nature or disposition of the thing being acted upon.
Can you give an example? I think they used an analogy.
Yes, the famous analogy is that of pushing a cylinder versus pushing a cone on a flat surface. Imagine you give both objects an identical push. That external push is the antecedent cause. It represents fate setting things in motion.
Right.
But how do they react? The cylinder, because of its internal nature, its shape, rolls straight. The cone, because of its internal nature, rolls in a circle. The external push, fate, only initiated the motion. The internal disposition of the object determined the specific quality and form of the resulting movement.
Okay, I see. So applying that to humans, fate provides the external circumstances, the push, the situation we find ourselves in.
But it is our internal nature, our rational soul, our character, our developed dispositions that determines how we assent to the impressions arising from that situation, and thus how we respond and act. The external cause provides the initial impulse or impression, but the internal cause, our reason, our judgment, our character, determines the assent and the resulting action. And that, Chrysippus argued, is where moral responsibility resides.
So our assent is fated in the sense that it's part of the causal chain, but it's our assent stemming from our character, so we're responsible for it.
That's the core of the argument. For the Stoics, our ability to reason, to assent or dissent based on our understanding, is internal and up to us, in the sense that it proceeds from our nature, even if the nature itself is part of the fated cosmos. It's a compatibilist position trying to make freedom compatible with determinism.
But predictably, perhaps, the skeptic Carneades was waiting in the wings again, arguing that this clever distinction didn't really solve the fundamental problem, did it?
No. Carneades launched a powerful critique. He argued that if the Stoic definition of fate is correct, that everything happens by antecedent causes, then even our internal assent, our character, our judgment, must itself be necessitated by prior causes stretching back infinitely. If that's true, he claimed, then Chrysippus's distinction ultimately collapses. The internal cause is just as determined as the external one.
So Carneades is saying you can't just carve out a little pocket of responsibility within a completely determined system.
Essentially, yes. He argued that the Stoic definition of fate logically entails necessity for all events, including our choices. And if our choices are necessary, then the fundamental Stoic ethical premise that something is truly in our power is contradicted. He saw it as a deep, unavoidable contradiction at the very heart of their ambitious philosophical project.
And the Stoics just had to insist that the rational choice was the internal cause and leave it at that.
Pretty much. They stubbornly maintained that our rational assent was the locus of responsibility, that it was internal and up to us in the relevant sense, even within the grand tapestry of fate. It remained a point of intense debate.
Meanwhile, over in the Epicurean camp, they faced a very similar, perhaps even more acute philosophical conflict arising from their own materialism. Their physics, based entirely on atoms moving and colliding in the void according to fixed laws. Well, that sounds just as deterministic as the Stoic system.
If not more so in some ways. If atoms just mechanically collide and rebound according to necessary laws, then everything, including the complex atomic arrangements that make up our minds and bodies, seems predetermined.
Which clashes violently with their strong insistence on human autonomy, the need to choose to limit desires, to take responsibility for cultivating tranquility. How did they try to escape their own determinism problem?
They needed to find a way to physically break the seemingly unbreakable chain of atomic causation. And Epicurus' solution was radical, famous, and controversial. He introduced the atomic swerve, the clinomen.
The swerve. This is the idea that atoms, as they're falling through the void or moving generally, can randomly, spontaneously, without any cause, just deviate slightly from their determined path.
Exactly that. Usually, atoms follow straight, determined trajectories due to weight and previous collisions. But Epicurus posited that occasionally, at no specific time or place, an atom can make a tiny, undetermined swerve just slightly off course.
And the purpose of this random swerve was?
Its primary philosophical purpose was precisely to break the rigid chain of causal necessity inherited from earlier atomists like Democritus. By introducing genuine indeterminacy right down at the fundamental atomic level, Epicurus aimed to create the physical possibility for freedom and voluntary action at the macroscopic human level.
So the swerve introduces a bit of randomness into the system, ensuring that our actions, which are ultimately composed of atomic motions, are not rigidly necessitated by the infinite chain or prior atomic states. It provides the physical gap for free will to operate.
That seems to have been the intention. The swerve ensures that not every event is the predetermined outcome of previous events, thus preserving the possibility that our choices truly originate within us as agents, allowing for genuine moral responsibility, praise, and blame, which were central to the Epicurean ethical project.
That feels like, well, a pretty dramatic, almost ad hoc physical contrivance just to save human freedom from their own physics. Like a philosophical deus ex machina, a god from the machine, swooping in to fix the plot.
It is often criticized exactly that way. It seems like introducing randomness just where you need it to solve a philosophical problem created by your own deterministic premises. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Carneades the skeptic had something to say about this too.
What was his take on the swerve? Did he think it worked?
Interestingly, Carneades argued that the swerve wasn't even necessary for the Epicureans to defend the kind of freedom they wanted. He thought they could have achieved it much more simply just by using logic.
How so? Without changing their physics?
Carneades suggested that the Epicureans were mistakenly assuming that if you could predict a future event based on physics, that meant the event was necessary or causally determined. He argued that the truth of a future contingent statement like, "I will choose to go for a walk tomorrow," does not logically entail that the event itself is causally necessitated. The statement can be true now without the walking itself being physically unavoidable.
So Carneades was trying to separate logical truth about the future from causal determinism, saying they were confusing the two.
Precisely. He was essentially saying, you don't need to mess with physics and introduce random swerves across the entire cosmos just to save freedom. You can defend it on logical grounds by showing that predictability doesn't equal necessity. He offered a much cleaner, more elegant philosophical fix that didn't require such a radical and, frankly, unevidenced physical hypothesis.
But the Epicureans stuck with the swerve.
They seem to have felt the pressure of their own strict materialist physics so strongly that they believed a genuine physical break in the causal chain. The swerve was absolutely essential to guarantee that choice could truly originate within the agent, uncompelled by the infinite prior history of atomic interactions. It remained a core, if contentious, part of their system.
It's just remarkable, isn't it? These incredibly sophisticated debates about the nature of knowledge, control, desire, freedom, and fate happening over 2,000 years ago. But they provide such deep, robust frameworks for analyzing our own lives today. Let's look at how Stoic principles, for example, still echo so powerfully in modern applied ethics, maybe particularly in fields like medicine.
Yes, the relevance is striking. If you look at a lot of modern medical ethics, it's often centered on principles like patient autonomy, informed consent, often drawing implicitly or explicitly from a Kantian tradition focused on universal rules and rights.
Right, defining duties and rights.
Stoicism offers a really interesting and arguably complementary counterpoint. It provides more of a micro-ethical first-person perspective. It's less about defining abstract, universal principles from the outside and more focused on the internal process, training one's own judgment, managing one's emotional responses, and developing rational discernment within the specific challenging context.
So the emphasis shifts from the external rule or right to the internal quality of the patient's or physician's reasoning and choice.
Exactly. The Stoic approach is focused on cultivating the virtues necessary for good decision-making in difficult circumstances. It's about inculcating habits of mind that make self-knowledge and rational assessment possible. Think about a really tough end-of-life scenario, maybe a terminally ill patient considering physician-assisted death or deciding whether to refuse potentially life-prolonging but burdensome treatment.
How would a Stoic approach differ there?
Well, a typical modern ethics discussion might focus heavily on the patient's right to choose or the physician's duty to preserve life. A Stoic-inflected conversation, while respecting the patient's agency, would likely focus more on helping the patient clarify their own values and make a judgment based on their own rational assessment of their condition and prospects. The choice itself, whether to refuse treatment, whether to affirm a path towards death, is evaluated primarily as an exercise of the patient's reason concerning their own state. That evaluation, that judgment, is what is fundamentally up to them.
So it's about the quality of their reasoning in facing their situation, which they recognize includes elements like the illness itself that are not up to them in difference.
Precisely. The goal is achieving internal consistency, exercising rational judgment virtuously, even when facing the ultimate indifferent physical decline and death. It's about maintaining the integrity of one's reason in the face of things one cannot control.
Now, if Stoicism provides this powerful framework for managing existential choices, the Epicureans, especially with their taxonomy of desire, offer what feels like an almost devastatingly relevant critique of modern consumer culture. It's like they wrote it yesterday.
It's genuinely chilling how relevant it feels, isn't it? If you take their classifications seriously, that the desires for unlimited wealth, for social status based on possessions, for constant novelty and luxury are unnatural and unnecessary, well then the Epicureans basically diagnosed the primary drivers of much of modern affluent society as fundamental sources of anxiety, dissatisfaction, and ultimately unhappiness.
Because these things chasing endless wealth, fame, the next upgrade are inherently hard to secure, insecure once you have them, and totally dependent on external validation or opinion.
Exactly that. You are perpetually chasing a goalpost that is not only external, but constantly shifting based on what others have or what society currently values. Think about the anxiety generated by social media comparison, the pressure of keeping up with the Joneses, the endless cycle of wanting the newer, bigger, better thing. The Epicureans would say the worry, the loss of time and energy, the compromise of your own autonomy involved in pursuing these unnatural desires is completely antithetical to achieving ataraxia, that stable inner peace. You end up sacrificing your tranquility for desires defined purely by empty opinion.
And it's fascinating that modern psychology actually seems to provide quite a bit of empirical support for this ancient diagnosis, doesn't it?
It really does. There's a large body of research now on subjective well-being, on happiness, that consistently shows that once basic needs are met, essentially, once you have secured the Epicurean natural and necessary desires, what they might call natural wealth, further increases in income and material possessions do remarkably little to increase long-term happiness or life satisfaction.
People just adapt to the new level of luxury. The hedonic treadmill idea.
Exactly. People quickly habituate. The strong correlation between wealth and happiness really only holds significantly at the lower end, lifting people out of genuine poverty and insecurity. For those who are already reasonably comfortable, chasing more money or more stuff primarily seems to increase their expectations and the scope of their desires, ironically making them less easily satisfied and arguably less autonomous. The ancient Epicurean insight seems powerfully vindicated. The truly smart strategy for sustainable well-being might be to consciously reduce and simplify your desires, rather than constantly striving to acquire more external resources to satisfy ever-expanding, unnatural ones.
Okay, finally, let's just circle back quickly to the resilience of skepticism. Despite facing that powerful charge of apraxia, of inaction right from the start, the skeptical project somehow endured. It remains this intriguing alternative model for how to navigate the world without firm beliefs.
It does. The Pyrrhonian strand of skepticism, in particular, survives that inaction charge by making that crucial move we discussed, replacing dogmatic beliefs, which they suspend entirely, with simply paying attention to appearances, the phantasiae.
Acting based on how things seem, without committing to whether they really are that way.
Exactly. The skeptic lives undogmatically, guided by natural instincts, like hunger and thirst, by the traditions and laws of their society, by the skills they've learned, and by these plausible appearances, all without ever needing to assent to the underlying truth or reality of any propositions about the world. This non-dogmatic psychological state, they argued, is perfectly sufficient to guide practical life.
And even their ultimate goal, tranquility, is pursued based on appearance, not belief.
That's the elegant, almost paradoxical core of it. The skeptic observes that dogmatists, people who hold firm beliefs about good and evil, truth and falsehood, seem constantly troubled. They're anxious about finding the truth, distressed when their beliefs are challenged or proven wrong, agitated by disagreements. The skeptic, by contrast, suspends judgment on all these contentious issues. And then, they claim, tranquility, ataraxia, follows unexpectedly, like a shadow follows a body. They pursue tranquility simply because it appears to be a preferable state, a desirable psychological condition that seems to follow from suspending judgment, not because they hold a dogmatic belief that tranquility is the ultimate good.
And this raises that fascinating ongoing debate. Is this kind of thoroughgoing skepticism actually natural for human beings? Or is it a highly artificial theoretical stance that's hard to maintain?
That's a great question, and philosophers have argued both sides. David Hume, for instance, famously suggested that our tendency to operate based on belief in an external world in cause and effect, our everyday, common sense, non-skeptical attitudes, these represent our natural propensity. He thought achieving genuine philosophical skepticism required immense intellectual effort and was an inherently unstable, unnatural state that dissolves the moment you, say, leave your study and play a game of backgammon or chat with a friend. You just snap back to common sense.
But others have argued the opposite.
Yes, others argue that there's actually a deep inherent impulse within human reason itself to question, to seek justification, to try and transcend our own limited particular point of view. And that very impulse, they suggest, contains an equally natural inclination towards skepticism when we realize the limits of our justifications. So is skepticism an artificial construct or a natural consequence of self-reflective reason? The debate continues. But either way, skepticism forces us to confront the profound limits and challenges of our entire knowledge project in a deeply valuable, introspective way. So we've really journeyed through some incredibly sophisticated, fully integrated philosophical systems today, haven't we? We've seen how these Hellenistic schools, Epicureans, Stoics, skeptics, each constructed these remarkably robust architectures where their physics, their understanding of the universe directly informed their epistemology, their theory of knowledge.
And that theory of knowledge, in turn, defined the very possibility and the path towards their ethical goal, flourishing, eudaimonia, ataraxia.
Exactly. Whether they were arguing fiercely for the absolute necessity of the Stoic cognitive impression to fend off error, or controversially introducing the Epicurean atomic swerve to carve out space for freedom within a deterministic cosmos, or indeed arguing for the suspension of all belief. Their core drive, underlying all the intricate arguments, was fundamentally the same: to provide the rigorous intellectual and practical tools needed to build a mind free from disturbance, a life lived with clarity and peace in a turbulent world.
Okay, let's just try and unpack this core tension maybe one last time, because it strikes me as so central. Both the Stoics and the Epicureans, these giants of Hellenistic thought aiming for complete systems that guarantee stability and happiness, they both found themselves forced by their own premises to introduce concepts that felt, well, frankly paradoxical or deeply counterintuitive to common sense.
Like the Stoic indifference or the Epicurean swerve.
Exactly. Saying health isn't really good, saying atoms randomly jump, or the Stoics demanding that near impossible standard of the catalepsis. It feels like they had to perform these complex philosophical maneuvers, introduce these seemingly awkward constructs, just to salvage a workable notion of human moral agency, responsibility, and the possibility of achieving happiness within the often harsh constraints of a material world seemingly governed by fate or necessity.
It really does highlight the incredible strain, doesn't it? The inherent difficulty placed upon any philosophical system that attempts to provide a truly totalizing explanation, one that seamlessly integrates physics, epistemology, and ethics into a single, coherent, livable whole. It's an immense ambition.
It absolutely is.
And perhaps it leaves us with a provocative thought to ponder. Its Stoic virtue, as they claim, resides only in the aiming well, the telos, and not in actually hitting the mark or achieving the external success, the scophos. And if Epicurean happiness is found primarily not in maximizing acquisition, but in rationally reducing desire down to the natural and necessary, the easily obtainable, then how much of what our own modern culture relentlessly defines as success, the career ladder, the relentless accumulation of wealth and status, the pursuit of external validation, how much of that is actually, from these ancient perspectives, just a profound distraction, a diversion from the only thing that perhaps is truly and fundamentally in our power, the quality, the integrity, and the rationality of our own choices right here